Okay, hello. I'm going to go into more detail about one of the things Jarno mentioned, preprocess2, and talk about how we upgraded. So this is now the new default. Jarno showed the big change we made, adding that extra digit, and I'm going to talk about how I tested that with our extensions. So I'll talk a little bit about our plugin, and then why we updated and how it went. Like Jarno, I've been working on this for a long time, so that's who I am. Target audience for this presentation really is anyone with a custom HTML5 plugin who might see some changes as we update this. That's true whether you have, like we do, a relatively straightforward one that just calls some initialization stuff and then calls DITA-HTML5 and then cleanup, or if you already might override the core DITA to HTML5 processing. So our plugin itself, we have a bunch of stuff that is related to style to make our Oracle Cloud Infrastructure documentation look like it does. None of that is impacted here. That all comes after preprocessing. But we do also have some customized preprocessing. We customize some steps to modify the messages that are generated. That's going to get a lot easier with 4.2, which I'm excited about. We have some customizations to modify how attributes cascade within maps for special metadata that we use. We generate a metrics report for authors. We customize how the topic pool works. We tweak the maps ahead of chunking so that we can enable that metrics report. As I said, we have a bunch of stuff in here. In the end, it's not too complicated, but a bunch of stuff. So how would I describe preprocess, the legacy preprocessing? Yeah, it's sort of spaghetti-ish. It sort of grew organically where we said, okay, we need a step to do one thing, like cascading map metadata. We need a step to do another thing, like chunking. And they sort of kind of fit in where seemed appropriate at the time. And it's like, well, we know it has to go after this thing and before this thing, so let's just stick it here. There wasn't a real thought of, over the next 20 years, we're going to have all this different processing. So let's figure out a logical way to do it. No, that's not how it happened. That's more how preprocess2 happened 20 years later, well, 15 years later. So why do we use preprocess? Well, we started with DITA-OT 3.4 with our customizations. Preprocess2 was there, but it was not the default in HTML5. So we stuck with the defaults. So looking at this from the toolkit perspective, if we want people to use preprocess2, and I wasn't using it because it wasn't the default, clearly it's time to make that the default. So for the upgrade, if you want to test yours out before you make the upgrade, it's a lot easier if you're on a recent DITA-OT. That's going to be true with most of this stuff. It's much easier if you have test cases for everything you override today. Generally good advice for any toolkit customizations. So for the first steps for my test, got the latest toolkit. I used 4.1.2 rather than using the latest developed code just because I didn't want to have any other variables in there. Like I know that we're working today with 4.1, so I got the latest version of that. And I'm going to try to compare my output today, my output when I add the 2. So I just went in and added a 2. So instead of preprocess, I'm calling preprocess2. And then I ran it, see what happened. Didn't work. More or less what we expected. So I knew I had to update something. So where do I start? So I look at all the things we customize. And the first thing I think is, do I need all of this? And this here is actually, that's a copy-paste comment from one of our overrides. It says, it provides a temporary fix for a linked GitHub issue. You can probably remove this if you're using 3.6 or greater. Okay, I should have taken this out a few years ago. So that code's thrown away now. So get rid of technical debt like that. And I did have test case to make sure that kept working. So I was safe there. But I've gotten rid of my technical debt. Tests are still failing. So what do I do? Well, this is DITA to HTML5 directly out of the 4.12 code. Does some initialization, now calling preprocess2, and then the topic processing. So what I did was make my own OCI DITA to HTML5. So all I did was just make my own copy of the target where I'm going to call my own preprocess, because I know I'm going to need to customize something in preprocess. So what's going to work? Well, my XSLT extensions, they all work. We're calling the same XSLT. All the customizations I have for conref, for topic pull, no change there. Everything's great. As much as I can, following best practices, I've always isolated my ant extensions to the preprocess pre and preprocess post. Also unaffected. Those work great. So the tricky things that I have to worry about are the ones where I've integrated in the middle of preprocess, which is always kind of a here be dragons thing to do. We have these extensions. It's a foot gun, as Jarno described. You can do a lot with it, but whenever we make changes to preprocessing, you're liable to run into trouble, which is what's happened here. So I've got a couple of different things that I stick in before chunking, and then one thing that I stuck in before the move meta step. So looking at this, I think when I put this in, I had two different targets that run before chunking. So now I'm probably going to have to like customize things all the way down until I get to chunking, customize chunking so that it does my other stuff. But maybe not. So this is preprocess2, basically, in the toolkit today. It does some initialization, it's stuff that we don't need to worry about, but there's the map first part and the topic next part. So we process all the maps, we process all the topics. When I look at what I was doing with chunking, all that really mattered was I do it before chunking runs, which happens in that topic section. So I can just stick things in between. So I've got map first processing, do the things I needed to do, and then the topic next processing. So far, I haven't had to touch that preprocess2 maps or preprocess2 topics. Keep it simple. But I've got one more thing where I customize attribute cascading. And so I kind of assumed going into this, I'm going to have to override how we do the map first part, stick something somewhere in the middle to keep this working. So this was my assumption going in. So I actually started this, I created this. And then I realized maybe I don't need it. What I actually need is just something that runs before metadata cascades. It can happen several steps before, it can happen right before. The only reason I put it where I did initially was because that made sense. Like, again, this is what we had, so it's the spaghetti code. Stick it where it fits. So now, attribute cascading also happens when we process topics because it's pushing metadata into topics. So that, just like my other ones, can go in between the things. So I actually ended up with pretty light touch customization. I had my chunk and my metadata extensions. They go in between those two core components of preprocessing. No impact to XSLT, no impact to styles, no impact to the preprocess post. And so I didn't have to touch the things. Like going in, I thought I was going to have to customize a lot more than I did. It actually ended up being really straightforward. So the final result, basically this is a copy paste of preprocess, but with three little targets in the middle. Ones that previously I had scattered in random places that didn't really make sense. So now at this point, I really need to test to make sure it's all working. And so my unit test passed, but what I did was take the largest set of content we have that we process regularly, about 15,000 topics, and build it. And I build it with preprocess2 and with the code we have today. Just side-by-side output directories and compare them. My results were pretty good. The first thing, which I was pretty excited about, was image paths are condensed. This is what I get from preprocess, the top line. Preprocess2 looks better. Resolves the same way, but the code's cleaner. The HTML is cleaner. Unique IDs changed. That didn't surprise me. Everything's processed in a different order, so whenever you run a generate random number function, it's going to get a different ID. And I found one bug that's kind of easy to work around. Out of 15,000 topics, one real edge case with how we were processing thing hit a couple of topics. And I talked to our information architect, and he said, yeah, we shouldn't be doing that anyway. Like, get rid of that code. And so for us, it was really easy to work around. So what if you did this, you follow this process and you test it, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's something that's actually critical that's missing from preprocess2. You can actually follow the same steps I did to undo preprocess2. So I created OCI DITA-to-HTML5 and added a 2 as part of testing before it was the default. Once it becomes the default, you can do the same. You can create your custom DITA-to-HTML5 and take away the 2. All of a sudden, it works exactly like it did before. You're using the legacy preprocessing. I would recommend, if you do that, open a bug report for the things you found. And assuming that gets fixed, at that point, you'll be able to upgrade. So going forward, I do have a new dependency that I didn't have before because I have to watch for changes to preprocess2. So if map first processing itself changes, I'm going to have to keep up with that and follow those targets. But it's a lot easier to follow those. That doesn't change very often. It's easier to follow those than it is the spaghetti code that we had previously. And I'm a lot less likely to be impacted if steps move around within preprocess itself. which is really one of the big benefits as toolkit developers now. If people can do their processing in a light touch way like this, like either before everything, after everything, or right in that middle section, it makes developers like Jarno the life a lot easier because you can move everything around inside the preprocess. As we figure out how the toolkit needs to work, things move around and we don't break plugins. And that's it. So really my summary was do all of this with a recent toolkit. You're going to be a lot better off if you try something with new code. Clear out any technical debt if you can. I mean, that's kind of an evergreen comment. Anytime you have a chance, you should throw out the code you don't need anymore. Unit tests are good, integration tests are good, and yeah, that's about it. Don't do more than you need to. Any questions? I hope we're still ahead of schedule. Yes, Jarno.
Will the open toolkit be adding an extension point so you can easily add the stuff in between the map and the topic?
So the question, for those who couldn't hear the planted question, was will the Open Toolkit team be adding an extension point right here so that I don't even have to do this part, so that I can just add things in? Why, that's a good idea. I think maybe we should consider that. Someone should open an issue. Anything else that's not quite so planted? Yes?
I've recently upgraded several I've recently upgraded a few HTML plugins, nothing to do with changing your trans type, but actually doing plugins. And I was using the copy HTML pre-endpoint legacy, which I didn't realise. Have you come across issues there? Because I certainly have. I know how to fix them, but have you any advice on updating just the plugins rather than the whole process?
The whole preprocess. My advice generally is stick to the targets like this one down on the bottom, preprocess post. I've heard about one of the issues you encountered with copying CSS, I believe. And that's something where the order might not particularly matter. How we handle that in our OCI plugin, as I said in the past, we just called DITA to HTML5, and then everything else that we needed to do, I put after that. And so for our CSS, that's where it would happen. So we build the HTML, we do everything the toolkit does, and then any extra processing I need that can come later, it goes later.
The solution I found was that you typically need to extend both preprocess pre and preprocess post.
Yep.
For preprocess pre, you need to set a flag saying, hey, I'm HTML. And then preprocess post is when you actually do whatever your legacy stuff is. Because otherwise, if I'm, say, running the PDF plugin, I get a CSS file, which I don't want.
Yeah, in some of our preprocess post extensions, which for those who are really getting tired of the word preprocess, it's stuff that happens after the map first processing. So after all that background stuff happens, we have a bunch of common operations. And in those, I generally check the format like that. So if it's HTML5, I'll copy our CSS or the other images we might need for flagging, things like that. If it's PDF, I don't. So very similar to that. Anything else? All right. I think we are done. Roger.